Okay, everyone, welcome to our final Philosophy of Physics seminar of the term. We're delighted to have Justin Holder speaking to us. So Justin did first a BA in philosophy at the University of the West Indies before doing an MST in the study of religion here in Oxford. And now he's doing a DPhil in philosophy under the supervision of Professor Jan Westeroff and our very own Dr. Adam Colton. He works on conventionalism and structuralism in not only Madhyamaka Buddhist philosophy, but also analytic philosophy of science and how the two can come into contact with one another. And today he's going to be talking to us about Poincaré's radical ontology, which is based upon a very nice paper which just came out in Corpus. So we're all keen to hear what you have to say, Justin. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, James, for introducing me, and thanks for inviting me to do this, and thanks everyone for coming to listen to me. I want to mention I got into this. As James mentioned, my background was in Indian Buddhist philosophy, and specifically a philosopher named Nagarjuna. And what I think Nagarjuna is up to is arguing that any judgment you make about whether something exists or doesn't exist doesn't have a truth value. So the idea of existence and existence don't actually latch on to how reality actually is. And when I thought that I had figured that part out, the next move was to go into philosophy of science. It's because I think if you want to take any metaphysical view seriously, this day and age, you should see how it works in science. So that took me pretty quickly to structural realism, and still figuring that out, but very quickly that took me to Poincaré. And that's how I'm going to pronounce Poincaré. I can't do the full French, the R that you pull from your whole throat. But I was really surprised when I actually read Poincaré, because I found that a lot of his metaphysical opinions were a lot more radical and out there than what I would have been led to believe by the secondary literature. And so this project came out of that, where I was trying to, at least in these sources where he says these things, really explicate what he's getting at. And so I wanted to mention my background for two reasons. One, because it's maybe kind of interesting, but also so that you know to be suspicious of me. Because you can say, well, all these intelligent people have read Poincaré. Why are you the first one to realize he said these things? And if it's because it's kind of similar maybe to what Nagarjuna was saying, it might be because I saw in him what I wanted to see. And that's a legitimate concern. And just aside from me in general, it's a bit suspicious when someone says, oh, this well-known figure has said actually these out there things. So I think I have a really high burden of proof here. And for that reason, I think this paper doesn't really work at all unless I reach a really high standard of textual evidence to show not just that what Poincaré said is consistent with what I'm saying he said, but that I can really show that this is what he meant to say. And so if you're going to contradict what I'm saying, well, you have to face the text, and there'll be apparent contradictions there as well. So what I'm arguing in a nutshell is one, Poincaré did say things that were kind of straightforward structural realism in Science and Hypothesis, in one essay in Science and Hypothesis at least. But in The Value of Science, in other places where he talks about his metaphysics, he directly contradicts that. So that's the first thesis, that there is a genuine discontinuity in Poincaré's work. Secondly, his relationism in those latter sources, what I call relationism because I think it's a better word than structuralism, is very much a phenomenological relationism. It's not trying to tell us about what's science teaching us about the unobservable nature of the world. It's really a kind of empiricism. And third, that he thought that the existence of the external world and any external objects is in fact a convention. So anything saying that the external world exists for Poincaré is a convention. It's nothing that is true or false. Right, so to begin with, let's go over what a convention is for Poincaré. The short version is, it's a declarative sentence, so something of a propositional form, which doesn't have a truth value. It's not that does it not have a truth value, but you have free choice in whether or not to accept it. So this idea of having free choice to accept or reject a convention is essential to it. And most people will, it's working, right? Most people will know, or I should say, if you don't know, Poincaré is well known for his geometrical conventionalism. He's known for thinking the axioms of geometry, like Euclid's postulates and so on, are conventions. They're not true and they're not false. So in that case, the reason that he gives for it is they're nothing that can be confirmed by experiment. And he's quite a neo-Kantian, so there's nothing that can be, they're not synthetic a priori intuitions, but there's something that we can be guided by experiment, and we have some choice in laying the ground for it. And I'll just read the end of this, where he says that because of their identity as conventions, these postulates may remain rigorously true, even when the experimental laws which have determined their adoption are only approximate. And so, of course, this is the first issue in reading Poincaré. He's very imprecise with his language, because I just said conventions don't have truth values, and now he's saying they're rigorously true. But just a few words later, he asks, is Euclidean geometry true? And he says that this question has no meaning. He writes that we might as well ask if the metric system is true, if the old weights and if the old weights and measures are false. So the key here is what he means by rigorously true is rigorously true in the sense of a definition. He's saying that the axioms of geometry are definitions in disguise, he says. And that just means, so the way that a gram always weighs a gram, no matter what experiment you do or anyone will ever do, a gram weighs a gram, a meter is the same length of a meter. That's always going to be true because some people at some point defined it as such. And it's not something that is open to empirical disconfirmation. So it's in that sense that conventions are always, or will rigorously true no matter what the experimental context. And from that, it's really important to note that conventions aren't, the reason we have free choice in the convention isn't epistemic. It's not that we don't know whether they're true or not. It's that they're the kinds of things which there is no fact of the matter about, independent of our decision to adopt them. And that is going to carry over to his ontological conventionalism. So when he says the external world, the existence of the external world is a convention, he really does mean there is no fact of the matter of whether it exists or not. He's not trying to negate it. And this, by the way, is something I meant to mention earlier. Actually, no, I'm going to mention now, that is, please keep in mind that necessarily, if P is a convention, not P is also a convention. Because if you have a choice to accept or reject P, it just means that you have the choice to accept or reject not P. That's obvious, but it gets a bit tricky when you start talking about ontological conventionalism. Because if I say that the existence of this chair is a convention, it's a bit hard, like, am I saying that the chair isn't there? Because the chair seems to be there. Okay? And it's kind of hard to detect what you mean by that exactly. So that needs to be supplied by some philosophical theory that we'll get to. But on the point that I just mentioned, you'll notice that the reason that these axioms are conventions is because they're definitions, but the external world exists doesn't seem like it could be a definition of anything. So there doesn't seem to be an analogy between the two that can go the distance. And we'll need to keep an eye out on what's going on there. Also, you might be tempted to think that this just relies on a kind of rigidity in what counts as true. So Élie Zahar had a paper where he argued that you only get geometrical conventionalism if you adopt what he called a problematic positivist principle, whereby kind of empirically indistinguishable descriptions or models, none of them can be true because you can't distinguish between them empirically. They make the same empirical predictions. And of course, if you use a standard for truth like that, it's pretty easy to get conventions out of them because you're declaring that things that people might think have truth values actually don't. So Poincaré isn't doing that either when it comes to the existence of the external world. We'll get to what he is doing. But for now, let's move on a bit to mention the sources that I'm looking at. So this is really a close reading of 3 essays, the introduction to his second book, The Value of Science, and the final 2 essays is Science Artificial and Science and Reality, which were originally developed from, originally a single paper, which he expanded in his book. And the context for those latter essays, at least, was that he was trying to distance himself from a man named Edouard Leroy, who was also a conventionalist, but kind of extreme conventionalist. He thought that all scientific facts in general were just kind of the conceits of scientists that didn't really give us information about how the world was. And Poincaré, being known at this point as a conventionalist, wanted to say, this isn't what I think, and Leroy is wrong about that. Science actually does give us information about the world. And that's quite important in the context of this project, especially because it means that in these sources, he actually has a maximal motivation to be as realist as he can be, because he's trying to separate himself from someone who thinks is too anti-realist. So he has every reason to be as realist as he can be and to really specify what his commitments are in terms of what exists out in the world and what science tells us about it, which makes it, I think, a really good thing to read for this particular issue. And let's look at this top quote. I gave the whole thing, which I realize might be a bit much. I'll just read the end of it, but it's the one that everybody knows from the structural realism literature. And you'll see it all over the place, where he says, but these, where he means things like motion and electric current, are merely names of the images we substituted for the real objects, which nature will hide forever from our eyes. The true relations between these real objects are the only reality we can attain. And so that's straightforward, right? That's straightforward structural realism. He's saying, one, that there are real objects out there with relations between them. And he's saying that what science does is it teaches us about those relations that are between those objects. And this is completely contradicted in the VOS sources. And for the first part, the existence of real objects, it'll take us some time to see how he contradicts that. But the second part, that science teaches us about the relations between those real objects out there, I mean, he contradicts in the introduction with this quote, does the harmony of the human intelligence thinks it discovers in nature exists outside of this intelligence? No, beyond doubt, a reality completely independent of the mind which conceives it, sees it, or feels it, is an impossibility. A world as exterior as that, even if it existed, would for us be forever inaccessible. And so he makes an epistemological point at the end, that even if it exists, but realize that that comes as a form of a concession. Before that, he says its existence is an impossibility. So his original point isn't epistemic. He's making quite a strong claim here. So yeah, that's set the ground and acknowledge that there's this continuity. But let's now move on to see, well, what is his structuralism? Why does he talk about relations if he's not talking about the relations of things as they are out there? And to start with, I'll call his view relationism rather than structuralism. There's a reason for that. Of course, I'm going with the regular view that structure is the abstract pattern formed by relations. So two different relations in two different domains can instantiate the same structure. And there's some weight to this because Carnap later criticized Poincaré for focusing on relations instead of structure. I'll get into that in detail a bit later, but I just wanted to say that I call it structuralism because I think that first Carnap was right, that Poincaré was focused on relations and not structure. And so that's how we should think of him here. But why relations? And how he gets to relations is in search of objectivity. So I'm going to read actually 3 quotes in pretty quick succession. I'm sorry about that, but as I said, I have a high standard of textual evidence to cover. So I need to show you that what I'm saying he's saying is what he's saying. So the first quote, where he's just kind of opening up why he's going into this, he says, what guarantees the objectivity in the world of the world in which we live is that this world is common to us with other thinking beings. Through the communications that we have with other men, and we denounce the archaic gendered language, but we receive from them ready-made reasonings we know that these reasonings do not come from us, and at the same time we recognize in them the work of reasonable beings like ourselves. And as these reasonings appear to fit the world of our sensations, we think we may infer that these reasonable beings have seen the same thing as we, thus it is we know we have not been dreaming. Such, therefore, is the first condition of objectivity. What is objective must be common to many minds and consequently transmissible from one to the other. We are even forced to conclude, no discourse, no objectivity. And he moves on quite quickly to say that, to give an example of what kind of thing is objective. So he says the sensations of others will be for us a world eternally closed. We have no means of verifying that the sensation I call red is the same as that which my neighbor calls red. In compensation, what we shall be able to ascertain is that for him as for me, the cherry and the red poppy produce the same sensation, since he gives the same name to the sensations he feels and I do the same. Sensations are therefore intransmissible, or rather all that is pure quality in them is intransmissible and forever impenetrable, which is not the same with relations between these sensations. So one thing I want to highlight here is how skeptical his stance is. He doesn't use these observations about intersubjectivity with other people to say that, well, therefore we should trust our sensations. He's saying, well, no, if what is objective is based on what's transmissible, actually we can't transmit the quality of our sensations, therefore we can only trust what's transmissible, which is the relations between them. So he's very skeptical. That's how he's getting here. And
sorry, just one, is there a flat out contradiction in that first paragraph?
what do you mean?
We have no means of verifying the sensation of red is the same. So the reading is so we can be sure is the same. So
Too sure it's the same.
The person A has sensation one and the same sensation. Person B has same sensation. Both times with him, there's no fact about it.
Yeah.
it goes on to say that we can be sure that it is the same.
But I can look at these two chairs.
Right. So the point is, so if we go with the chairs, so what I see here, I call red, but what I call red, you might call blue, right? So it's the kind of thought experiment that maybe the actual appearance of what I call red is different from what you call red, and we can't verify whether or not what I call red is the same thing as what you call red. What we can verify is that we both use the word red for this color, and so these two things we will both call red, and so we will call they're the same color. So specifically, what is the same is the color of these two chairs, not the sensation of red. That's what he's saying.
And I think for this we're reading the words flat out contradiction. I mean, I understand to verify as to ascertain. But I take your point. I mean, it's not clear what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
Well,
look at
translation.
This is the translation is no, it's a really good one. I did look at the French for a lot of these passages, but it's a good translation that was done while he was alive. I think he read it and wrote his own. I left my French book at home. Okay, but we'll move on and cover a lot more of this and have more to talk about with this. So this is a really pregnant quote. So pay close attention to it. From this point of view, all that is objective is devoid of all quality and is only pure relation. So I shall not go so far as to say that objectivity is only pure quantity. This would be to particularize too far the nature of the relations in question. But we understand how someone could have been carried away into saying that the world is only a differential equation. With due reserve regarding this paradoxical proposition, we must nevertheless admit that nothing is objective which is not transmissible, and consequently that the relations between the sensations can alone have an objective value. So a few comments here. The first is that we understand how someone, in the English it's a bit ambiguous, but in the French he says je ne sais plus qui, so he's instead of je ne sais pas qui. So he's saying I don't know anymore, or I don't remember who who said this thing. So it seems like he had someone in mind, which I think is kind of interesting, especially because this sounds like a kind of early version of ontic structural realism, at least the kind that Max Tegmark and so on will proposes as, well, the whole universe is actually a mathematical structure. Other structural realists are a bit more reticent about saying something like that. So Ladyman and Ross, I think, say they refuse to answer the question of what makes worldly structure different in nature from mathematical structure. Stephen French has a whole chapter kind of talking about this issue that, from what I remember, doesn't come to a solid conclusion about it. But in any case, what Poincaré is saying here, at least, is that this isn't the kind of view he wants to promote, that the nature of the world and the nature of these objective relations he's talking about is indistinguishable from mathematics. But the big question we have here is, if he's saying that pure relation is devoid of all quality, what is left of it, what's left of the nature of the relations in question, if they're also not pure quantity? Unfortunately, he doesn't say too much about this. Really wish he did, but we can try to figure out, well, we can try to figure it out based on what he does say. So the first point of departure is this last clause here, where he says that the relations between the sensations can alone have an objective value. That's a stronger claim than you might think looking at it, because what he's saying isn't just that what's objective in sensations is the relations between them. He's saying that the relations between sensations specifically are the one thing that have an objective value. So you'll remember that his first condition of objectivity was transmissibility. Here he gives a second condition of objectivity, which is that whatever is objective must correspond to sensations really experienced. So he says the first condition separates reality from the dream, and the second distinguishes it from the romance novel. So he's very clear that actually the only thing that can be objective is the sensations we experience. I don't think he bases many arguments about this, but it's clear that this is at least what he has in mind. So these quotes are from towards the end of Science of Is Science Artificial? And this is where he's really trying to pin down what the nature of the objective is. He says, since the enunciation of our laws may vary with the conventions that we adopt, since these conventions may modify even the natural relations of these laws, is there in the manifold of these laws something independent of these conventions, and which may, so to speak, play the role of universal invariant? And then a couple pages later, at the end of the essay, he answers, what now is the nature of this invariant is easy to understand, and a word will suffice us. The invariant laws are the relations between the crude facts, while the relations between the scientific facts remain always dependent on certain conventions. So what's a crude fact? In short, a crude fact is the sensation that you have itself. It is an experience. So he also says this, it is necessary to distinguish between the impression of obscurity felt by one witnessing an eclipse and the affirmation it grows dark, which this impression extorts from him. In a sense, it is the first, which is the only true fact in the rough, and the second is already a sort of scientific fact. So the crude facts really are just these pure sensations, this extra-linguistic, theory-independent, is just the given in experience. And the scientific fact is really any attempt to represent these crude facts in language or mathematics or any system that involves conventions. And this is key to Poincaré's big move against Leroy, because what Leroy is saying is that all scientific facts are completely separate from actually what we gain in experience. It's just a fancy of scientists. But Poincaré is saying, no, the scientific fact is only the crude fact translated into a convenient language. So for Poincaré, the objectivity of science is grounded in this universal invariant, which is sensation itself. And that means that we can always, once you have a scientific fact that records a certain experience adequately, all of that scientific language will be intertranslatable. because it has that objective fact as a fulcrum. So returning to the question of what's left of pure relations if we take away all quality and what makes them not all quantitative. I think now that we know that these relations actually holding between actual sensations, I think what Poincaré had in mind is that, well, but because sensations aren't quantities, certain relations hold between them that don't hold between quantities. So in the example he gave, where this notion of sameness between color, so what makes the poppy the same color as the cherry, I think he thinks that relation of sameness isn't the same one that would hold between the sameness of number between a group of 4 poppies and a group of 4 cherries. I think what he has in mind is that it's not just a logical relation of identity that we're dealing with. It's an actual phenomenologically laden relation that is sameness of color versus sameness of something else. And of course, you can use quantitative reasoning to think about sensations. But if he's really thinking that these are kind of phenomenological relations specifically that might have various relations between them which can't be captured quantitatively, that'll explain at least what he means by that would particularize the nature of these relations too far. But I do wish he said more about this because he didn't say that much. But from this, we can move on to Carnap's criticism of them, actually. So Carnap quoted Poincaré as saying that the relations between the sensations have an objective value. That same sentence we saw before. And Carnap writes, "This obviously is a move in the right direction, but does not go far enough. From the relations, we must go on to the structure of relations if we want to reach totally formalized entities. Relations themselves, in their qualitative peculiarity, are not intersubjectively communicable. It was not until Russell that the importance of structure for the achievement of objectivity was pointed out." So you could take this a few ways. You might think, well, what Poincaré really did mean was the structure of relations, not relations themselves. But I don't think so. I think Poincaré did mean relations and not structure. And I think Carnap was wrong about this. So when Poincaré discusses the nature of this universal invariant in those quotes that we saw before, he does make it clear that that universal invariant only holds between beings who have similar enough sense faculties to receive similar impressions and who have the same logic. And so I think what he's saying is that, for example, 2 sighted people through language and ostentation can communicate to one another that they're having a visual experience. They might not be able to communicate the content of the visual experience, but I do think that it's implausible for someone to argue that we are unable to communicate between one another, that we are having an experience and that the experience is at least of this or that vague type, just because we have this commonality between each other of how we interact with the world. How do we know that? Because we can communicate it between each other. So I think Carnap here has conflated the idea of totally formalized with intersubjectively communicable. I don't think they're coextensive. I think there's a distinction between the content of a sensation and the nature of that sensation the content of a sense impression and the nature of a sense impression as sensory. And neither of these are formalizable. I think only the former one is intransmissible, right? So I think we can have what Poincaré wanted, which is phenomenal relations that we can communicate between one another. But even though we can't communicate the quality of them, we can communicate what nature they have. So that's why Carnap's wrong about that, I think. So summing up, relationism, it ends up being not something that teaches us anything about the nature of the unobservable reality. All it is a means of finding out what is objective in our experience and in our science. So I think it's instructive here to actually compare him with Van Frassen a little bit, because where Van Frassen wants to save the phenomena by embedding the structure of a data model within the empirical substructures of theoretical models, Poincaré is trying to save phenomenal relations by embedding them within convention-dependent mathematical systems, which enable us to see all of the harmony between them. So, different language, but I think the aims are actually quite similar. And I'm not saying Poincaré and Van Frassen, same guy, same opinions. I don't think that they are, but actually on this particular matter, I think their views about the aims of science actually come quite close to one another. And that's important because reading about Poincaré, often you would think that he and Van Frassen are opponents on this specific issue. But in fact, it's the opposite. I think this is where they come closest together. Okay. Yes, now we can move on to objects. What do objects have to do with all this? So he says that external objects, for instance, for which the word object was invented, are really objects and not fleeting and fugitive appearances, because they're not only groups of sensations, but groups cemented by constant bond. It is this bond, this bond alone, which is the object in itself, and this bond is a relation. So his use of object in itself, I find, is quite interesting. Obviously, Poincaré knew his Kant. I think he's here disavowing this idea of their noumenal objects that we can't interact with. He's saying, no, what an object is this relation between sensations. And of course, here we don't have conventionalism yet. We just have the same relations between phenomena that he's been talking about. But he's saying what an object is just one of those relations, or relations of a certain type, the ones that kind of bond different relations together. And he takes this quite far. So he says, it may be said, for instance, that the ether is no less real than any external body. To say this body exists is to say that there is a bond, there is between the color of this body, its taste, its smell, an intimate bond, solid and persistent. To say the ether exists is to say that there's a natural kinship between all the optical phenomena, and neither of the two propositions has less value than the other. So he's just completely collapsing the distinction between observable objects and unobservable theoretical objects. Because for him, well, what an object is a bond between sensations. So if you have a theoretical object that's where you found this bond between these sensations that maybe weren't obvious, that's just another object. And it exists based on the same criteria as anything else that you interact with. And he really pushes this point by saying, and the scientific syntheses, like the ether, have in a sense even more reality than those of the ordinary senses, like tables, since they embrace more terms and tend to absorb in them the partial syntheses. Saying more reality is a bit dubious, I think. I'm not sure what that means. But we can see what he's getting at, because if what an object is just this bond between sensations, well, if you have these theoretical objects that are a bond between lots of sensations, maybe all sensations of a certain type, then there's somehow even more of an object than the ones that we recognize. What he means by partial syntheses, I'm not sure. My best guess is that it's something about kind of a conditional bond between sensations, maybe. So some sensations are only conditionally related, and what theoretical objects do is help us to articulate what those conditions are and why. But I'm not completely sure. So if anyone has good ideas, I'm all ears. So this, what we have here is he's labeling these phenomenal relations, these relations between sensations, as objects. But that's not quite what we're interested in, right? What does he think about the idea that there are things that exist independent of experience? So usually for us, an object isn't just a relation between experiences, it's something else. And does he say anything about what those are? And that's where we start to get to his conventionalism. So to ease into that, there's this quote in Science and Hypothesis, where he says, these two propositions, the earth turns round, and it is more convenient to suppose that the earth turns round, have one and the same meaning. There's nothing more in one than in the other. And at first it seems quite striking, that the idea that the earth turns round is just a convention. But he does explain here that he just sees this as a consequence of the rejection of absolute space. So there's no point of view from which you can say for sure the Earth turns around or it doesn't. You can say that the Earth stands still without any loss of truth. It's just that doing astronomy or other sciences has become incredibly, impossibly difficult. So we just say that the Earth turns around because it's more convenient. Okay, so fair enough. It's not actually that radical. If it's just a maybe striking or interesting thing that follows from the rejection of absolute space. But then in The Value of Science, he reacts to some of his readers in a very interesting way, I find. This is maybe my favorite quote by him. He says, these words about the Earth's rotation, his words about the Earth's rotation, have given rise to the strangest interpretations. Some have thought they saw in them the rehabilitation of Ptolemy's system and perhaps a justification of Galileo's condemnation. Those who have read attentively the whole volume could not, however, delude themselves. This truth, the Earth turns round, was put on the same footing as Euclid's postulate, for example. Was that to reject it? But better, in the same language, it may very well be said, these two propositions, the external world exists, or it is more convenient to suppose that it exists, have one and the same meaning. So the hypothesis of the rotation of the Earth would have the same degree of certitude as the very existence of external objects. So this is wild, right? Because he could have just gone with the absolute space explanation. He was obviously irritated by people drawing all sorts of weird conclusions from his statement in the other book. But instead of just saying, hey, I was just talking about the consequence of rejecting absolute space, he says, well, if you like that, you'll love this. It's not just the Earth's rotation. All of this is a convention. Everything, all of this idea of an external world and external objects, all of it is a convention. And his language, at least here, is completely clear, right? It's not epistemological. He's saying that the two propositions, the external world exists, and it's more convenient to suppose it exists. They have the same meaning. And he's also explicitly comparing it and saying it's the same kind of proposition as Euclid's postulates and the rotation of the Earth. So it's clear that he's saying that this is a convention. And that would mean that there is no fact of the matter of whether the external world exists or doesn't exist. So is that what he could have meant? And I think, yes, it is what he meant, but we do need some background to see how to interpret this, what it actually means. And I think, well, no, I don't think, I think it's pretty clear that it's because he thinks that the nature of of reality in general is transcendent. So this is my other favorite quote by him, where he says, I call it the speechless God quote. He says, it is not only that science cannot teach us the nature of things, but nothing is capable of teaching it to us. And if any God knew it, he could not find words to express it. Not only can we not divine the response, but if it were given to us, we could understand nothing of it. I ask myself even whether we really understand the question. So again, he doesn't deign to tell us why he thinks this, but because we know of his various neo-Kantian leanings, I think it's not a far leap to say that this vaguely Kantian reasons for thinking this. He thinks that our understanding is part of our cognitive endowment, that is separable from the external world. So anything that we think or believe about is just a formation of our understanding. It's something that happens inside of us. And the nature of reality is just something else entirely. So just as a result of that, he just doesn't think that anything we can ever think or judge applies to the nature of reality as it is, including, of course, existence, which Kant has as one of the fundamental categories of the understanding. So judgments of existence and non-existence are also something that our understanding does, not something that can apply to how reality is in itself. And yeah, that's the long and short of it. From that perspective, because those judgments are just something that we do, and not something that applies to reality, we can legitimately say the external world exists or it doesn't exist as we like. It's never going to be ultimately true or ultimately false. But we can leave this section with a little bit more realism, because he does have this notion of objective convenience. He says it will be said that science is only a classification, and that a classification cannot be true but convenient. But it is true that it is convenient, and it is true that it is so not only for me but for all men. It is true that it will remain convenient for our descendants. It is true, finally, that this cannot be by chance. So this is an early no miracles argument for not the truth of theories, but the objectivity of convenience. We can legitimately choose whether or not to what axioms of geometry to use, whether or not we want to say that the chair exists if we want. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that the reason Poincaré used the external world is because he thinks it's absurd to deny that it exists. But the reason for that is because of how inconvenient it would be. So these are things that we accept, and there is an objectivity to how convenient they are. None of us can decide that it's actually more convenient to act as if the external world doesn't exist. So at least what conventions are convenient and what aren't seem to be determined by what reality is like. So that's it in his view in a nutshell. But there's a problem with it that I notice that he doesn't address, which is that he's relying on this idea that there are other minds. But if the whole external world and external objects are conventions, why is it not true that the idea that other minds exist also a convention? And so I think this dilemma starts forming. I'm not sure if this is actually a dilemma, but it's a dilemma that he might face. That if other minds only conventionally exist and objectivity depends on other minds, which he says, that means objectivity itself is dependent on a convention. And this isn't acceptable for him. The whole point of him writing all of these things was to be a bit more realist than Leroy. He doesn't want to accept that objectivity itself is a matter of free choice. But if you try to argue then that other minds don't have a conventional status, you might get the second harm, where that argument then can show that that external objects also don't have a conventional status. So what he needs is a way to think that it's factual that other minds exist, but only a conventional stipulation that external objects exist. And how can you do that? I think it is at least not immediately defeated, because the first thing we need to do is make it so that the statement other minds exist doesn't just entail that external objects exist. And one way of doing that is to just define a mind, first of all, as a manifold of experiences, because Poincaré thinks that there are experiences for sure. And I at least know that there are some experiences, I'm having them. And if I believe that the nature of reality is completely transcendent, because that's the engine of his conventionalism, I don't think that stops me from saying that there's a fact of the matter of whether or not there are other experiences outside of my manifold. Right? So if I ask Poincaré's God, who can't tell us anything about the nature of reality, well, are there experiences that I don't have? God can probably say yes or no. I don't think the fact that we can't understand the nature of reality prevents it from answering that question, because we can understand what experiences are, and it does make sense to ask whether or not there are some that we don't have. So that makes us not immediately fall apart. But then there's still the question of how can we know that other minds exist. And I think there are two possible ways out for Poincaré. You can argue, as he does, that there is good evidence against solipsism. So I showed you the quote before, where it's just a paragraph of him saying, we encounter reasonings from other people and can infer that they've experienced something like what we'd have, and we know that there are other minds, so on. But that seems completely inadequate for how skeptical he is. I mean, surely, if you're going to doubt the very content of our sensations and rule off the factual existence of the external world, you can be more skeptical than that. But I think you can reinforce his argument. So if you say, well, reasoning is essentially self-conscious. So if I am reasoning, I must be aware that I am reasoning. And you also say that reasoning can only be done by a mind. Then that can give you the evidence you need, because then if I encounter some reasoning, I can know that I didn't come up with it. And I can know that a mind must have. So that would give us some evidence for other minds. And that's not completely weird. And there's quite a bit of literature in European and American tradition of philosophy about self-consciousness, particularly to do with rationality as well. And in the Indian tradition, there's plenty of work about self-consciousness, about consciousness being reflexively conscious of itself. So it can't be dismissed out of hand. But the other option is to just admit that there isn't good evidence against solipsism here, but to argue that that isn't really fatal to Poincaré. And one way you might do that is say, well, I mean, very few of us actually take it upon ourselves to prove solipsism wrong, or very few people maybe even think that anyone has successfully done that. We just don't bother with the question. And maybe Poincaré can do the same thing, but that's a bit iffy because Poincaré is a lot more skeptical than most of us are. So you might say, well, no, he has more of a responsibility to say why we don't fall down that rabbit hole. But you could say, well, just because Poincaré doesn't declare for himself a kind of full Cartesian skepticism, and just because he's more skeptical than most people doesn't mean he has to be maximally skeptical. So maybe you can throw him a bone and let him have that one posit that, yeah, other minds exist. And then he's just in the same boat as the rest of us, where that's just something that we kind of have to assume because it seems obvious enough. But I'm not sure if either of these definitely work to make this view come out coherent. But I would say that they don't definitely not work. So this doesn't just all kind of collapse in on itself at the end of the day, I don't think. Yeah, so from there we can just, sum it all up. That what I've said is his views in the theories of modern science and science and hypothesis is incompatible with his views in the VOS sources. His relationism in the VOS sources is phenomenological and closer in metaphysical import to constructive empiricism than to structural realism. And he regards the external world and external objects as existent or non-existent only by convention. So that's the talk. Thank you for listening.